Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk entitled Beyond the Page Reading Smarter with Artificial Intelligence. My name is Dean Hill, and on a part time basis, I'm a postgraduate researcher in the Department of English Literature here at the University of Birmingham. Now, before we move into the substance of today's presentation, I want to briefly explain how I've designed this session. I've structured it to flow continuously without unnecessary divisions between introductory ideas and more advanced literary or methodological reflection. My aim is to make the session fully accessible to general readers while giving literary scholars, teachers, and researchers something intellectually substantial to take away. I also want to be clear about the format. This is not a live workshop where we will all stop and try prompts together. Instead, think of this as a set of practical strategies for later, for tonight, tomorrow, or the next time you sit down with a novel and feel that familiar sense that there is more happening in the text than you can quite grasp on your own. So essentially, I want you to go away with a toolkit of ideas and strategies that you can try, that you can perhaps develop, that you can implement into your reading practice to have a more meaningful, more deeper sense of that relationship, to cement and reinforce uh, your love and your passion for reading, while seeing the, I think, possibilities of artificial intelligence in aiding you to connect with that book, to have that more meaningful discussion and debate with the large language model. And the core claim I want to advance is quite simple. The challenges of serious reading are real and they are shared across levels of experience. So fiction can be difficult because it demands memory, it demands contextual knowledge, patience, pattern recognition, interpretive courage, if you will. And artificial intelligence, I believe, can help with those demands, but only if we treat it not as a replacement for reading, but as a reading companion or a questioning partner. There's a particular frustration, I think, that many readers know well. You finish a novel and you put it down with the feeling that something important has happened just beyond your reach. You understand the plot, perhaps even the characters, but you suspect that the book was doing more than you were fully able to register. I think that feeling matters because it tells us something true about literature. Serious fiction is never only the sequence of events in front of us, it's also a structure of motifs, voices, omissions, historical pressures, formal choices, critical afterlives. The solitary reader often encounters all of that without support. If we take a book like Mrs. Dalloway, for example, many readers understand the social surface and still feel that Woolf's movements in time and consciousness are doing something they cannot fully name. Artificial intelligence becomes useful here because it can solve the text, if you will. But because it can help a reader ask better questions about what they are sensing, that's when it becomes a really fulfilling tool as well. So when I say something like reading smarter with AI, I do not mean reading faster, skipping the text, or outsourcing judgment. I mean learning how to use a conversational tool to support the kinds of mental work that literature already demands. Noticing, contextualizing, comparing, interrogating, returning, etc. So if we then begin with the problem, as I alluded to just now, most reading happens alone. And you could say that that's the great thing about reading is that it's an intimate one-to-one experience between you and the author, between you and the text. Most of us do not have a literature seminar available on demand. And even those of us who work in literary environments spend far more time reading in private than discussing in company. That matters because reading is not simply reception. Reading, I think, is this active interpretive process shaped by prior knowledge, expectation, memory, inference. One reason flowcharts and other process visuals are useful in teaching is that they help make sequential thinking and relationships visible, which is exactly what readers often need when a complicated process is otherwise kept in the head. Think about, just as an example here, the difference between reading Jane Eyre by yourself and reading it in a room where someone asks you a question like, what does the novel do with voice, confinement, surveillance, the politics of emotional self-control? Suddenly you are not just following Jane's story, you are reading structurally. Or imagine reading The God of Small Things alone versus reading it with someone who can explain why communism, for example, matter at the level of form as well as theme. Artificial intelligence does not replace that seminar. It does not replace a supervisor, a friend, a skilled critic, but it can partially compensate, I believe, for the absence of an immediately available respondent. It can keep the conversation alive at the exact point when your curiosity would otherwise collapse. It can help you preserve momentum. For literary scholars, there is also a methodological point, which is a good use of AI is not to generate your interpretation for you, but to simulate some of the functions of scholarly conversation. So, naming frameworks, surfacing counter readings, mapping contexts, and asking the question you have not yet asked yourself. So, there are two tools you will probably be familiar with. Before I talk about strategies, I want to distinguish between two broad modes of using AI for literary reading. And on the screen here, you've got three models which you no doubt will be familiar with: ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini. And these will be the three models that I will use to illustrate particular points throughout this talk. There are others out there like Perplexity, which you will probably be familiar with too. But for the purpose of this talk, I will be talking about these three models in particular. Some reference perhaps to others like Perplexity. So the first is what we call standard chat, and this is almost like the default position of large language models. And this is what most people think of first: ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, similar conversational tools. These are, I think, most useful when you are in the middle of a novel and you need help with something immediate. So, for example, you have encountered a historical reference you do not understand. You want three interpretations of a recurring image. You want to test whether the atmosphere of a chapter is doing something politically or psychologically significant. If you're reading fiction, standard chat is often the better first tool because fiction generates questions in motion. You are, for example, halfway through Middlemarch and need a character map. You're reading Frankenstein and want help distinguishing Walton's narrative function from Victor's. You're in the middle of Never Let Me Go and feel that the softness of the narration is doing something ethically unsettling, but you're not yet sure how to phrase it. The second mode is something called deep research. And here is where the AI retrieves and synthesizes sources rather than relying mainly on what it already knows. So this is most useful when your question is not what might this symbol mean, but what is the critical reception of the novel, or what historical context do I need to understand this book? Or a third one could be what does the current scholarship say about trauma in Beloved? There's another example, which I haven't put on the screen on this slide called audio overviews, which is something you can get from the functionality within a tool called Notebook LM. And this is where it generates podcast style discussions from source materials. And Discover sources can suggest and add relevant web materials into a notebook for further use. So that's another one perhaps that you could look into if that would interest you. But again, for the purpose of today, we're going to just be focusing on ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini. For literary readers, the simplest practical distinction is this. Use standard chat while you are inside the reading experience, and use deep research before reading, after reading, or when moving towards academic work. So that distinction helps to prevent a common mistake, which is expecting one tool to do everything equally well. We then move on to one rule, which is that this is a conversation, not a search engine. One principle underpins everything else, that you do not treat these tools like old-fashioned search engines. When readers use AI badly, they tend to type something like green light Gatsby meaning. That actually produces a generic, flattened answer. The problem is not only the wording, it's the absence of context. So fiction depends on nuance, sequence, uncertainty, and readerly position. If you leave those out, the tool cannot respond in a way that is truly useful to you. The better approach is to speak in full, precise sentences. Say what you are reading. Say where you are in the book. Say what you suspect. Say what you do not want. A good fiction prompt often contains four things. You have the title, you have your reading stage, your interpretive task, and your constraint. So one example could be, I'm reading The Great Gatsby, and I've just encountered the green light for the second time. I suspect it has something to do with longing or distance. Give me three possible interpretations without revealing anything beyond this point in the novel. And you could probably see that that's a much better way than searching for green light Gatsby. It tells the AI what role to play, how careful to be, what kind of answer will actually help you continue reading. And I think this matters all the more because recent literary benchmarking work shows that models still struggle with nuanced interpretation and nuanced interpretive reasoning. There's one called Christeva, the ACL 2025 benchmark for close reading, which evaluates the capacity of models to identify stylistic features, retrieve relevant contexts, and reason between the two. And its reported baseline results place model accuracy between 49.7% and 69.7%, still below experienced human evaluators on 10 of the 11 tasks. So, in other words, that means being specific isn't a luxury, it's a practical necessity. So, the takeaway strategy here is simple. Whenever you ask about a work of fiction, include your place in the book and your interpretive aim as well. I want to briefly mention this as something you could look into in your own time. If there is one practical framework I want everyone to leave with, it's this one: the anatomy of a high impact prompt. A useful literary prompt usually contains 6 layers. First one is role, what you want the AI to be; text, what you're reading; position, where you are in the reading; what you think already, so your hunch, confusion, your observation, task, what you want it to do, and constraint, what it must avoid. So let me give you a fiction example using Rebecca. You could say something like, act as a patient literary reading companion. I'm reading Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, and I've just finished chapter 8. I think the house is functioning as more than just a setting, and I suspect class anxiety is shaping the narrator's voice. Help me test that idea by giving me 3 focused observations I should watch for in the next few chapters. Do not spoil the plot. That's a high impact prompt because it does not ask for summary, it asks for attention. It helps the reader return to the novel with sharper perception. Or we could take one for the remains of the day. I'm halfway through the remains of the day. I feel Stevens's restraint is doing something ethically important, but I can't quite explain it. Help me articulate 2 or 3 possible ways that emotional restraint functions in the novel without revealing later developments. The practical rule is this: if your response is too vague, add your own thought to the prompt. The AI often becomes much better the moment you tell it not just what you are reading, but what you are wondering as well. We now move on to 2 modes of reading, for pleasure and for academic reading. Now, this talk is going to predominantly be based around fiction literature, but you can adapt this for academic reading as well. A very important distinction is between your purpose and how this changes, and how that changes how you use these tools. So if you're reading for pleasure, for example, your primary goal is immersion. You want the book to retain its emotional rhythm, its suspense, atmosphere. In that case, AI should be used lightly and sparingly. Short, targeted interventions are best. A glossary before starting, a quick explanation of a historical reference, a spoiler-free clarification of symbolic pattern. And we'll look at some of these as examples in this talk. If you're reading academically, however, that relationship changes somewhat because now the text is not only about an experience, it's evidence. You're building an argument. In that context, artificial intelligence can be used more intensively. You can ask it to map critical debates, outline competing frameworks, suggest neglected lines of inquiry, or stress test your own interpretation. But the crucial rule is this: bring your own thinking first. If you ask an AI to interpret Beloved before you have formed any view at all, you are very likely to receive something generic. If you instead say, I think the novel's structure makes memory feel less like recollection than compulsion, what are the strongest arguments for and against that? Then the AI has something to work with. So the take-home distinction is, for pleasure reading, use AI to remove friction, and for academic reading, use AI to intensify thought. So we're going to begin this session before you even read, to prepare the mind. And this is, I think, one of the most underused stages in fiction reading, because we need to begin the practical sequence before you begin the book. Many people simply start at page 1 and assume that good reading begins there. Often it does not. Often the first page becomes much richer if the mind has been prepared in advance. There are at least 3 useful take-home moves here that I'm going to explain. The first one is schema activation, background research, and spoiler-free orientation. These are especially useful with fiction that belongs to an unfamiliar social world, for example, political history, literary tradition. Readers often think the problem is that the book is difficult, when in fact the problem is that they are entering it without enough scaffolding. It's a bit like if you are a non-fiction reader, reading the table of content can often help you immensely. A novel like Beloved, for example, asks very different things from a reader than a novel like Pride and Prejudice, and both ask different things again from Atonement, for example. So preparing the mind means recognizing that before reading begins, interpretation has already been shaped by what the reader does or does not know. So if we begin then with schema activation, and I'm going to use Beloved as the example again here. So this is the first pre-reading technique. Take Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to talk about Pride and Prejudice and then move on to Beloved. Many first-time readers see Mrs. Bennet's urgency about marriage as comic excess. But if you understand entailments and the material vulnerability of women under that legal structure, the opening chapters change immediately. The comedy remains, but the stakes actually sharpen. If we take Beloved then, if a reader goes in with no sense of slavery's afterlife, of the relationship between historical trauma and memory, or of Morrison's place in African American literary tradition, the novel can still be deeply meaning, but much of its force remains harder to articulate. So the take home for this, the take home strategy is the prompt that you can see on your screen. And I'll read it for you. I'm about to read Beloved for the first time. Without spoiling the plot, prepare my mind by explaining the historical world of the novel, the kinds of questions it asks, and the literary tradition it belongs to. Think of this as preparing my mind rather than briefing me. Or you could put something like, do not summarize the story. That phrase, prepare my mind, is powerful because it encourages orientation rather than synopsis. So one of the most practical habits that you can form is, before any major novel, spend 5 minutes building your schema, and it will really have a significant impact. It's not cheating, it's not spoiling it for you. It's essentially activating the brain, preparing and scaffolding you before you start that book. Again, you won't have time to do this with every single book that you read, but for classics, harder pieces of literary fiction, or books which you have wanted to read for a long time, or a part of a university course, you may wish to try this. The second one is something called deep research, which I mentioned at the start of this presentation. And this is all about going deeper into the reading. Some novels require more than a conversational orientation. They require actual research. And this is where deep research tools become especially valuable. ChatGPT, I believe that that's still free to use on that tier of that model of that tool. Gemini, I believe, they offer this as well. But just be aware that some, like Claude, for example, they may have you pay for these additional functionalities. But these are valuable because they can gather material from multiple sources and give you a structured overview to verify later. I mentioned Notebook LM earlier. Notebook LM now supports source-based summaries and source discovery workflows. So this can help readers assemble supporting materials around a topic. So if we use an example such as The God of Small Things, a reader can absolutely appreciate the book emotionally and stylistically without detailed historical knowledge. But a fuller understanding of caste, of communism, of the novel's critical reception, it transforms what you notice in the narration. So here's a take-home strategy that you can use. And this is the prompt that's on your screen. I'm about to read The God of Small Things. Please research the author's background, the critical reception, and the historical world it inhabits, particularly the caste system and communist movement. Compile this into a reading guide with no plot spoilers. You may also wish to use phrases such as verify what matters. If the AI gives you the option to use deep research, then I would suggest that make use of that functionality. If the AI gives you citations or claims about critics, click through them and confirm them. The AI can help you reach the conversation more quickly, but it should not be the final authority about what the conversation contains. So always check your sources. So the take-home rule here is use deep research to build a reading dossier, not to substitute for scholarship. Deep research is great for giving you cited information and texts and even quotes, but I would always recommend checking those using a more scholarly means of doing so. Your academic library, Google Scholar, however you want to do it. We then move on to something called a spoiler-free glossary. Now, this pre-reading move is especially useful for fiction when you have dense social worlds. Some novels are hard not because their language is intrinsically obscure, but because they assume you are familiar with a network of names, institutions, factions, cultural references, etc. Wolf Hall, I think, is a classic example of this because many readers find the opening chapters disorienting because Mantle can be unclear at times, or it could be that the world is crowded and politically charged. So there's a strategy here that works quite well, and it's the prompt again, which you can see on your screen. Or another way of saying this could be, before I start Wolf Hall, give me a spoiler-free glossary of the main historical figures, family relations, institutions, and political factions that a first-time reader should know. Explain why each matters in one or two sentences without referring to future events in the novel. So for a general reader then, this reduces friction. If you're a scholar, you can push this a step further. You could give it a prompt such as, now make this an ideological glossary. Explain how the meanings of these terms or institutions were contested in their historical moment. So if a novel overwhelms you with names or institutions, ask for a spoiler-free glossary before you abandon the text. We're now going to move on to the middle of the reading experience, is where you start to ask better questions. This is where AI becomes most immediately useful for readers of fiction, because many of the best questions arise not before or after the reading, but during the reading process. So a phrase may feel strange to you, a scene may linger, a symbol recurs, a character's behavior seems disproportionate. Somewhere in the narration, something in the narration sounds false, unstable, or too carefully withheld. And most readers do notice these things, but the noticing often passes. The moment disappears because there's no one there to sustain it, and AI can help preserve that moment by converting it into an explicit question. So the practical value of this is, I think, considerable. Good reading often depends less on finding the right interpretation than on learning how to pause at the right points and ask sharper questions. And because these tools are conversational, you can keep refining. You can ask once, then push back, and then ask more precisely. That means the key mid-reading strategy is not ask the AI what the novel means. It's use the AI to sharpen what you already are beginning to notice. So we're going to begin then with something called confusion and noticing. Two moments come up repeatedly in fiction reading. The first one is confusion, which is where you encounter a name, an illusion, a setting, or a concept you do not understand. So a useful prompt could be, I'm reading The Great Gatsby or whatever it is. I've come across this particular reference. Explain it clearly and briefly in a way that helps me understand the scene, but do not spoil anything that happens later. The second one is called noticing, and this is the more interesting one of the two, I think, because this is where you keep seeing something recur. The green light in The Great Gatsby, windows and thresholds in Mrs. Dalloway, weather in Wuthering Heights, mirrors in Rebecca, etc. Bodily fragmentation in Beloved. At that moment, instead of asking, what does this mean? You could ask something like, I'm reading The Great Gatsby, and I've noticed the green light is recurring. Give me 4 plausible interpretations of what Fitzgerald might be doing with this image, including 1 psychological reading, 1 historical reading, 1 formal reading, and 1 reading you think might be a stretch. And this matters because AI is useful as a generator of possibilities, not always as a final court of appeal. And I think the rule here is every time a pattern appears twice, ask for multiple possible readings and not just one answer. So this is particularly useful. These two strategies are particularly useful at different points in the novel that you're reading. What I'm particularly fond of is character maps, because large novels often fail readers for one very ordinary reason. And a lot of readers put these books down because of this reason, that there are too many people. Not just too many people, but if you think of Russian texts with the pronunciations, and if you think of the different relationships and interrelationships and dimensions these characters may have, this is why books like Anna Karenina, Middlemarch, Bleak House, they can become exhausting, even when they are brilliant works of fiction. The mind is doing the character management as much as the interpretation. And a wonderfully practical technique I can give you, or tip, is to use AI to create a character map. And in the example on your screen, it's use Claude. So a prompt that you could try, which is on the left-hand side of your screen, is I'm on page 180 of Anna Karenina, or you could say I'm about 150 pages into Anna Karenina. Create a character map of everyone important up to this point. Include relationships, social position, and 1 sentence describing each person's main tension or desire. Do not reveal anything beyond page 180. And if you want to be more specific here, you could give it the chapter, because there are some versions of the text which the AI may think you're referring to, which have different page numbers. Ebook versions, for example, are different to paperback editions, or often different to the paperback version. So if you want to be even more specific, give it the chapter or the part of that text. That kind of externalization then frees your mind to return to theme, style, pattern. You can also adapt this as well, I think, for thematic reading. So you could give it a prompt like map the characters in Middlemarch according to how they relate to ambition, idealism, marriage, and money, based only on the chapters I've read so far, and obviously give it that context. So, if a novel's cast is draining your attention, and I've been in this situation many times before, outsource that tracking so you can keep the interpretive energy. Again, anything by Tolstoy, Anna Karenina has a huge cast of characters. Dickens's work often has large numbers of characters. It just means that you've got more attention given to the text and given to the narrative and what's happening than having to keep up with who's who and character names and so forth. The next one is also one of my favorites, vocabulary banking. And I think this is one of the richest but most neglected habits in fiction reading is vocabulary banking. So in a novel like 1984, language is not just decorative, it's structural. Terms like newspeak, doublethink, thought crime, unperson are not merely strange words, they are compressed political theories. And so the strategy I want to give you here is as you read, keep a small list of words and phrases that strike you. Don't, if you can, don't disrupt the flow by looking at word after word after word. Because at the end of that session, at the end of a chapter perhaps, or at the end of a number of pages, or the end of a section, paste those words into the AI and give it an instruction like the one you can see on your screen. Something along the lines of, here are the words I've collected from 1984. List those words that you've collected and then ask the AI to give you the definition, a note on the etymology or verbal construction, if that's relevant, what the word reveals about the world of the novel, and any ideological function the term seems to perform. And again, you want to be telling the AI where you are in that book so that it doesn't spoil anything in the remainder of the text. And this is powerful because it turns vocabulary into a form of literary analysis. The take-home rule here is treat unusual words in fiction as clues to power, worldview, and structure. And one of the ways I like to do this is just use the app, the Notes app on my phone, and write them down as I go. And then at the end of a chapter, I can feed these into Claude or ChatGPT and get it to give me a brief definition. And then perhaps at the end of a reading session, you could ask it to give you the history of that word or what it reveals about the world of the novel. So you can use it in a number of different ways, depending on if you're obviously reading on public transport, where you might not have the tools to do this or the time to do this. But if you're studying a text, you can certainly paste this into the LLM at that particular moment, perhaps, and have a more personalized vocabulary bank for you over time. This will build and build. So it's almost like you're building your own lexicon, a personal lexicon based on your reading experiences, which you can refer to, which you can look at, which you can save on OneDrive, or you can feed into, into a reading journal, or use as part of a review. Okay, so there's a number of ways that you can do this, and there's a number of outputs that you can try for this. The flip of this is, I think, a crucial shift in this talk, because if you think up to this point, much of what I've described still leaves the reader in a relatively receptive posture. It's passive. You're asking questions, the AI is answering you, that's useful, but it's also limited. The real change comes when the AI starts asking you questions. So this is what I mean by reading buddy mode. At the end of a chapter, you can say something like, act as a reading companion. Ask me one challenging interpretive question at a time about this chapter of Great Expectations. Do not give me answers. Push me to form and defend a view. Wait for my response before asking the next question. So you can see that it's powerful because you're going from your role as recipient to producer. Instead of consuming interpretation, you're required to articulate one. And that matters because close reading is not simply about the acquisition of meanings. It's the disciplined practice of formulating claims about textual evidence. And the Christeva findings I mentioned at the beginning are useful here as a caution because models still fall short of expert human interpretive performance on most tested close reading tasks. The strongest educational use is often not to let the system answer for you, but to let it push you into a fuller articulation. So you're not asking the AI to explain the book, you're asking it to make you explain the book. So let's go through a worked example, and hopefully you can see this. The first is the AI, in the middle is my human response, and the follow-up is the third block of text. So imagine the AI asking something like, is Joe's passivity in Great Expectations a form of moral goodness? Or does Dickens want us to see it as a failure to protect Pip? In whatever way that it wants to formulate that kind of question. Now, that's a good question because it creates this productive discomfort. It forces you to hold contradiction rather than settling too quickly into admiration or dismissal. And then once you answer, the AI can follow up. So it could ask you questions such as, what evidence in the language of the scene supports your view? What would the opposite argument say? Is your judgment shaped by Dickens's narrative framing? And that's the kind of pressure that builds interpretive muscle. But of course, you need to prompt the LLM before you begin in order to get these kinds of responses, which is why in the previous prompt, I was asking the LLM to challenge me essentially. But for more advanced readers, you can intensify that exchange. You can say something like, ask me the question I am unconsciously avoiding in my reading of this chapter. And that tends to produce surprisingly good prompts for reflection because it turns the AI into a device for locating your blind spot. And so when you give the AI your prompt, it's really good and useful to copy any brief observations that you've made, any notes that you've made on that particular chapter, because it's giving the AI a sense of where you are. It's getting into your mind, essentially. It's understanding your interpretations. And it can therefore use that to form part of its response. We then move on to becoming the author or a character. Now, this next technique sounds playful, but it can be analytically serious as well. It's almost like a simulated role play. You can ask the AI to become Mary Shelley discussing Frankenstein, or Stevens from The Remains of the Day, or Miss Havisham from Great Expectations, or as the prompt on the screen has, you could ask it to become Stephen King or Winston Smith. The point is not to believe that the simulation is somehow authentic. The point is to put pressure on your own understanding of voice, motive, perspective. So, for example, you could say, become Mary Shelley reflecting on Frankenstein. I will ask about ambition, creation, and responsibility. Respond as a plausible historical role play, but make clear where you are inferring. And that last part matters because we should not confuse role play with evidence. And for literary scholars, this sits very close to, I think, long-standing debates around intention and interpretation. The value here is not that the AI reveals authorial truth. It is that the simulation can generate hypotheses. When the answer feels wrong, that wrongness itself becomes useful because it shows you where your own reading resists the generated explanation. So I would recommend to use roleplay as a hypothesis generator, not as proof. But at the end of the day, it's fun. It's enjoyable. Reading journals and debates is a really good one. I want to draw your attention to because I see reading as this process where it's about compiling a history, a narrative. It's about documenting how you've traveled through these books, how you've grown as an individual, how your mind has grown, how your perceptions have changed. It's about coming back to a source in a year's time and seeing how your interpretation perhaps has changed when you reread a book. And the great part, I think, of reading, apart from having a reading journal, which is where you log what you've read or you use Goodreads or whatever, is a more intimate conversation between you and the book, between you and the author. And I like to use old-fashioned fountain pen and journal. Some people like to keep a electronic version of some kind of reflective log. But artificial intelligence is your reading record keeper that also can be quietly transformative because after reading, many of us have rough notes that are messy, they're fragmentary, they're half formed, and that's not a flaw. It's often exactly what reading notes should look like. But it can be hard to see the shape of your own thinking inside them. So I'm going to give you a practical prompt which you can try. You could say something like, and again, very similar to the one that we've got on the screen, here are my rough notes on Hamnet, or whatever book you have. Turn them into a short reading journal entry in my voice. Keep my uncertainties, include any question I seem to be circling without yet fully stating. And this is really useful because it preserves ownership while improving structure. If you ask it to just turn your notes into a reading journal entry, it can lose your voice. Now, the key part of this process is going to be your notes, your interpretations, and your observations. And so you don't want that to change. You don't want that to shift. You don't want those to be overridden as such and replaced. Now, for book groups, you can do something similar. You could say, turn these notes on The Handmaid's Tale into 4 debate propositions that would generate productive disagreement in a reading group. For academics, you could use a similar move where it becomes a pre-writing method. So you could say something like, here are 3 weeks of notes on text X. What recurring question or tension keeps appearing? What possible research question might I be moving towards? So use AI to organize your thinking, not to replace your thinking. Essentially, you're using AI to deal with the logistics of your reading life. Because the moment the AI replaces your thoughts or it eradicates them for something it thinks is better, that's when you lose the connection between you and the text. That's when it becomes not a personalized experience between you and the text, between you, the author. That conversation then doesn't exist. But yeah, it's really good for organizing into a template that you could, over time, use to create a reading journal. You could create it on OneDrive or print it out, whatever you want to do. So we're now going to move on to the next part of this talk. And on the screen, that's just finishing up on the reading journal and book club ideas I just mentioned about interpretations and tensions and having debate propositions created for you. We now move on to post-reading, which is the whole text is now your material. And this is where the conditions change. So spoiler anxiety now disappears. The text can now be handled as a completed structure. You can ask about endings, echoes, framing devices, withheld information, repeated images, structural parallels, etc., and the philosophical implications across the whole work as well. So at this stage, AI becomes particularly useful for synthesis. So you may ask, for example, now that I've finished Atonement, explain how the ending changes the ethical status of the whole novel. Or, I finished Never Let Me Go. Map how the novel distributes knowledge and ignorance between narrator and reader across the whole text. So this is where you move from local noticing to global structure. And the take home I would give you here is, after finishing a novel, use the opportunity to ask big structural questions that were impossible to ask responsibly at the start or in the middle of the text, because spoilers don't really matter anymore. This is a great way for you to use deep research to enhance your understanding. You could feed in those notes that we referred to earlier, those initial observations, and see how your observations stack up, perhaps against criticism of the novel. So this is where you could ask the LLM to give you some links to existing scholarship. Perplexity, as I mentioned before, is a really good one for this, and it's used widely amongst the academic community. So it will give you a cited source. It will give you a PDF link to a journal article, for example. So you could use deep research or something like Perplexity and those kind of features and those kind of tools to put you in the right direction to look at criticism or critical thinking on the text. Because again, you're not concerned about spoiling anything at all. But again, I would say in that instance, still put this into your own words, still make notes, still make observations, because otherwise it becomes just a copy and paste exercise, which we're trying to avoid. There are a number of extra features I would like to talk about to finish off this talk. And it's kind of to round out the practical side. There's a few useful tool features to mention. The first one is just to reiterate what I mentioned earlier with Notebook LM, which is especially helpful when you already have materials. So notes, articles, extracts, PDFs, draft writing, etc. And you want an AI system to work from that bounded set of sources. So audio overviews is amazing because it creates AI hosted discussions based on those materials. And its newer source discovery features can help gather relevant web sources into the notebook as well. And I've used Notebook LM to take my notes on 1984, for example, what I thought of part one, my initial observations, feed them into Notebook LM, and it will give you a 10-15 minute conversation between two AI generated individuals, presenters, speakers. And that's just really great for just consolidating that knowledge, particularly if the way that you learn is through auditory means as well. It's really great for cementing and reinforcing knowledge. Deep research style tools, which we've touched on, are often used by early early in the literature review, for example. They're great for contextual mapping, assembling a first bibliography around a topic. Their strength is speed and breadth. Their weaknesses is that they can still misread, overstate, or miscite if left unchecked. So deep research is great because it will give you citations, but sometimes those citations can be inaccurate, or the quotes that they give you may not be entirely true. They may attribute a quote to a particular source when actually it's found in a completely different volume. So uh, definitely use deep research for generating a cited report, particularly if it's something like author background or a particular thematic information you want to acquire a better book. Some people will say just go to Google and use a source on Google or your university's library, whatever. The benefit of deep research is that it can be personalized to what you want. An encyclopedia, an online encyclopedia, a book in a library doesn't allow you to do that. It doesn't allow you to personalize the prompt and get exactly what you want in one concise report. Standard chat, as we mentioned before, remains strongest for conversational iteration, so refining prompts, testing paragraph level ideas, generating questions, comparing interpretations, and helping readers develop their own lines of inquiry. So the practical rule is quite simple. Use source-based tools when documents matter. Use conversational tools when dialogue matters. And verify anything you may later repeat in writing or public speech. Now, we mentioned reading journals earlier, reviews, but there are some other tools which I can go through with you now. LLMs will accept a range of different file types and photographs. So you could upload PDFs, a journal, for example, and ask it questions about that, particularly if it's a journal which is a piece of criticism about a novel that you've just read. You could take photographs of your handwritten notes and ask the AI to generate a word-based document of those notes so you don't have to type them up. You could ask for summaries as well, or key quotes, or themes. You could photograph your own annotations and again ask the AI to organize them. So this is part of you creating that reading journal, that personalized log of your reading life. You could use audio and voice notes. You could speak directly to the AI. So you could ask it a question without having to type it in, and almost create a back and forth conversation between you and the large language model. So this could be a post-reading reflection, which you then turn into some kind of written output. You could then revisit those voice notes and ask the AI to turn them into some kind of structured journal entry. Mind and character maps we've already covered, but it's on the screen here. I think they are especially useful at the end of a book to create, because if you ever reread the text, you've got this large character map for you to look at again. You don't have to revise essentially and revisit character names, social relations, etc. That information is ready in a visual format for you to refer back to. Now, you can also use LLMs for reviews. If you leave reviews on things like Goodreads, or you have a journal at home, a reading journal, you could take your notes and ask the LLM to put this into a journal kind of entry for you. again, without losing your voice. So you could ask it to retain all of those notes in that form. So it's not going to change the content in any way, but it's going to give you that structure. It's going to give you that logistical repurposing of those notes. So I would advise you to do that. I would say to the LLM, here are my notes. I want you to put them into a more logical structure for me for my reading journal or for whatever record that you have, because you don't want the LLM to start modifying your thoughts. The whole point of this exercise is for you to maintain and retain a personalized log of your reading life, of your journey that you've experienced with these books. And if the LLM starts shifting that around and keeps uh, replacing words or reformatting sentences or inserting new sentences entirely, it's not gonna be an authentic record of you and the book. One I like to use is quizzes and vocabulary. So what I would do is I will finish a part of a book, like I did not so long ago, 1984, and I just told the LLM I finished part one of 1984. I want you to test me to reinforce my understanding. And then you can tell it specifically what kind of format you want it to test you in. Do you want it to give you yes or no kind of questions? Do you want it to give you multiple choice? Do you want it to give you a question so there's an open-ended text box there for you to respond to in sentences? Do you want it to follow up after each question, or do you just want it to give you 10 questions that you answer and reflect on? So that's a really great way of you consolidating and strengthening your knowledge. It doesn't rely on you having a teacher with you, but of course, as with everything with AI, um, make sure that you do check anything that's a quote. If it talks about a particular part of a book, you may want to just fact check that just to be sure, because the LLM can at times get confused between your prompt and what it's referring to. But I think for the kind of work we're doing here, on the whole, this intimate relationship with the text and enhancing your reading, a more deeper, meaningful interaction and engagement with you, the author, and the text, the free models of LLMs are going to be absolutely fine. It's just things such as citations and sources and direct quote which you may wanna check. Make sure that you enable web search. That's another tip to give you in your LLM, because that will go to the web. It will look up websites, it will look at blogs, it will look at points of authority um, in coming up with its response. We've spoken about trust and credibility, so don't need to go through that in any more detail, but usage limits is something to keep in mind as well, because tools will cap messages, uploads, and other features. So the basic models are generally fine for this kind of work, but if you use deep research or the more advanced variations of these models, of these tools, you will notice that your cap is hit a lot quicker, which is where you have to wait for the LLM to reset itself um, in the interest of fair usage before you can go back into that LLM to continue your conversation. So I'm going to finish off then with just a recap of that reading process that we've looked at today. The first one is prepare the mind. You then read the novel. You then notice what troubles or recurs. You then start asking better questions. And then you then switch to using the AI for context, for challenge, for structure. You then return to the text. You may then record insights and tensions. It's at that point you may need to verify sources. And the last part of this process is forming your own reading. So what does that process look like in action? Well, the input, of course, is the text. The output is that formation of your reading. So you start at the beginning, read your text. This is where you're engaging deeply. This is where you're highlighting, you're making notes, you're capturing what stands out. The second part is then bringing your questions to the AI. So you're asking it for context, perspectives, connections, or challenges. The third part of this process is where you receive insights and perspectives. So the AI provides that context, the evidence, the alternative readings, the structure that you can think with. You then move on to capturing what matters. So saving useful insights, tensions, quotes, and new questions as you go. And with that, it's completely up to you how you do it. Some people like to keep a reading journal. Some people like to keep a notebook and a pen at hand. Some people like to use an app on their phone. Some people like to then put everything into OneDrive and save all of this, or print it out. Completely up to you. Start to get into the habit, therefore, of building some kind of repository, journal, notebook collection, because this is where you're going to organize, connect, and reflect in your own words. And what I find it quite useful to do as well at this point is to, at certain points in the year, to reflect on your reading journey. So have a look at how many books you've read, what kinds of books you've read, what were your initial observations, and when you come back to reread them perhaps in the future, that may shift. So the whole point of this reading journal repository approach is for you to maintain that intimate connection for future iterations. And then, of course, the last one there is forming your own reading. So synthesizing, challenging, making it yours. That's the goal here, is to make this all yours. And then you can see on there, number 6, return to the text, as I briefly just mentioned. So this is where you reread it with new eyes. You notice more, you ask better questions. And if you don't have a record of your initial observations or those initial notes or some kind of journal, it makes it harder for you to make that comparison. So the input is the text. The process is AI as a reading companion. The output is your journal, a repository, an electronic file storage function, whatever that may be, OneDrive. And the growth is your reading. So AI doesn't replace reading, it deepens reading. So just to finish off with some frequently asked questions. Number 1, is this free? Many mainstream AI tools offer free tiers. As I said before, features, limits and access levels vary over time. So it's best to check current product pages before promising you any specific capability. Do you need to be technical? No, the techniques in this talk depend far more on careful prompting, with the anatomy of the prompt I showed you earlier and critical judgment rather than technical expertise. What if something goes wrong? Well, assume that it sometimes will. Treat factual claims, citations, quotes, as I said before, as items to verify before trusting or repeating them publicly. Is it cheating? That's another question. Using AI to avoid reading or to generate unearned academic work is a problem. Using it to scaffold, question, organize, and stress test your own thinking may be permitted or restricted depending on institutional policy. But if we are thinking purely here, reading for pleasure, outside of perhaps academia in your own time, then AI can be used as a really fantastic tool in that regard. Will it spoil the book? It can, unless you give it those explicit limits. So always state your progress in the text and tell it not to reveal anything beyond that point, which is why before I said it may be best to use chapters or parts or section numbers if you're reading non-fiction than a page number, because page numbers can vary between editions, and the edition the AI thinks you're referring to may not be the one you're actually reading. What about privacy? Well, don't assume privacy by default. Check platform settings, terms, etc. before uploading sensitive or unpublished material. Does it work for any book? It often works best where there's an abundant training or source material, so results may be weaker for highly niche, untranslated, or poorly documented texts. But if you have a copy of the text in some format, you can always upload it as a file. I find this particularly useful for a tool like Perplexity, where you may have a copy of the journal article and you want it to ask you questions on that journal article just to reinforce your knowledge of the text you've been reading. So a piece of literary criticism, for example. But just be aware of any laws, legislation, privileges, permissions around downloading and uploading copyrighted work or works which are protected by particular publishers. Can I really have a conversation with a fictional character? You can have a simulation of one. The simulation is not evidence, but it can be a productive way of testing your understanding of voice, motive, perspective, etc. How do I know if AI is hallucinating a citation? Well, you do not know until you check. That's why every citation worth using, I think, must be traced back to a real source. And what can AI genuinely not do? Well, it can't replace the lived, situated human experience of reading. It can't be the reader for you. And it cannot relieve you of the responsibility to judge and to criticize and to read critically. So, in other words, don't treat the AI as a substitute for reading, treat it as a companion or an aid to your reading process. All of the work you upload, all of the notes that you paste in, should be your own interpretations and observations and notes. Otherwise, it just becomes this detached task, this detached piece of work that you're doing over time, which isn't based on your initial observations or interpretations. And that means that a lot of it could be fabricated. A lot of this that you retain as notes or put into your journal may not even be your own work. So the origin point must be yourself. I want to end with just one final thought. These tools are remarkable synthesizers, supports, they're provocative. They can help us to prepare to read, keep questions alive while reading, organize our thinking after reading. They can help solitary readers feel less alone, and they can help scholars move more efficiently through context, debate, pre-writing. Notebook LM, for example, shows how strongly the field is moving towards workflows built around documents rather than just free floating chat. But they're not literary critics in any fully human sense. They do not possess that lived experience, that historical embodiment, or the inward life that makes reading matter. They don't know what it is to encounter beloved or at the right moment in your life, or to feel a sentence in Mrs. Dalloway or Wolf Hall rearrange your own sense of time. That remains yours. And perhaps that is the most reassuring thing of all. The task of interpretation still belongs to you, the reader. AI can offer company, structure, provocation, but the meaning of the book, in the fullest sense, still emerges in the encounter between a human mind and a work of art. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this was useful. I'd be happy to accept any questions regarding how you can use large language models to read more deeply, for a companion to enable you to fulfill that part of you which I think should be fulfilled, which is deeper, more meaningful reading, which is supported by a plethora of these tools that we now have at our disposal. But I'd also be happy to take questions on how to use AI responsibly and ethically, because that's a fundamental part of this process, is that it's not a copy and paste job. It's using tools appropriately to enhance your reading, your discovery, your sense of meaning, the purpose of why and how you read. So thank you very much for your time, and I really hope this was useful. Thank you very much.